The opinions expressed in the following program are provided for general information purposes only and should not be construed as advice from CJAD 800 or Bell Media. The following is sponsored content.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult FL Fuller, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Welcome to today's Entrepreneur, a program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business, presented by FL Montreal. Dan Delmar and Josh Miller with you this evening on a special remote edition again of the program. Hello, Josh.
Hello, Dan.
And this evening, we're going to do a bit of a tour of various areas, of course, another special on crisis management. We're going to start by talking about insurance. We're going to get to labor law. Of course, the latest updates on government subsidies and all that is on the way later in the program. And how to prevent insolvency later on the broadcast. First, Josh, any opening thoughts? How was your week last week? I mean, how are you coping with all this?
I think, Dan, it's very interesting. Of course, there's news that happens and is brought out every day. Again, I think it's all about communication, and it's all about managing people's fears to some degree. No question, managing the business and the slowdowns. I think it's a lot of discussions that I've been hearing about with bankers and financial institutions and potential subsidies. I think there's so much going on that like before, we were trying to find enough hours in the day. It's still the same case, just for lots of different reasons.
So we'll get to some of the specific issues in a little bit. Labor law with our guest, Louis Seveno from Woods. We're going to talk to, of course, some FL consultants later in the program as well about government support and more. Let's begin with insurance first, though, Josh. And joining us now is Jim Hindley from Hindley Financial Services. Mr. Hindley, welcome to today's Entrepreneur.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
How have you been dealing with this crisis? And what are your opening thoughts on leadership in these times of great stress?
Well, it's a very serious problem. It's affecting everybody, especially on the health side. But for a businessman, it certainly has affected his business. And they're all looking to see how the insurance companies are going to react to see if there's any type of business interruption compensation that they have a chance to recover.
Now, the two magical words, of course, and that's business interruption. And we understand that, it's quite controversial and there's still a lot of discussion that's happening. But generally, whether COVID-19 existed or not, what can you just explain or just describe what exactly is business interruption insurance?
Well, there's two types of insurance. There's property insurance, which protects all of the assets of the company. And then there's business interruption, which protects the financial structure of the company. But to trigger a business interruption loss, there must be physical damage to the property. And unfortunately, the insurance industry is looking at the coronavirus as not being a physical damage. So therefore, they're taking the position of no coverage under the business interruption section.
Now, but that being said, so regardless whether the government has imposed shutdowns or your staff is sick and away from home, that's still not falling under because there was no damage to property.
That's correct. Damage meaning, let's say, a fire, a flood, an earthquake, burglary, water damage. These are all physical damages. This is a virus. And even though the government has imposed strict closures on staying home, not going to work, it doesn't necessarily mean that the company or the business has had a physical damage. Now, it may be, but in my experience, this virus could disappear within a couple of days. It could be there for a lifetime, and nobody knows. I'm not a lawyer, but maybe it will be tested sometime in the court. Is virus a physical damage? I'm not so sure.
No, I understand. But there are, of course, still some businesses that are still working, still going on. And there's a lot of goods that are in transit, stuff that's on the water, stuff that's coming from Asia or elsewhere. How do you feel that is going to be treated?
As long as it's if it's in transit, it's in what we call ocean marine or air marine, it will be covered. not necessarily will be covered for contamination, but again, if physical damage. It will arrive on the shores and then come by rail probably, and then by truck to the client's premises. And then if it's arrived on time, he will be able to transport the goods to his clients and the deal is done. But that's very unpredictable in these times because some of the countries are not producing the goods or they're not shipping the goods to our clients here in Canada.
No, and if they get diverted or elsewhere, there was a case in January of certainly a ship offshore that got, I know it wasn't COVID related, but something happened and then, the goods just didn't arrive.
That's correct, because that was the Ancien ship. It happened in January. It caught fire. The tugboats were able to put the fire out. The boat was damaged. The salvage people decided to take it to the Bahamas. There was 3,700 containers on that boat, and they dictated that 1 to 20 bays were total loss, so people were able to recover their goods. Right. The balance, they had to wait until the goods arrived to see if they had received any physical damage.
So just to interrupt, Jim, just for a moment, just because we're running out of time for this segment, is if there is a small chance of people having access to some business interruption, what are the types of records that entrepreneurs should keep on hand? If
their business has suffered because of the damage, then they can recover all their gross profit from the business, losing a lot of money. So that's on the business interruption. If they had their inventory at selling price, they would recover their selling price. When it comes to the marine that we just talked about, if the people had extended their marine policy to cover contingency BI, and then because the ship was delayed to come in and the customer lost his orders, then they would recover the BI under the contingency BI. So that's what I would suggest to people when they're discussing marine insurance with their insurance people.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. Very, very informative, and still lots of information to be had and to be discussed.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Jim Hindley of Hindley Financial Services. And up next, Josh, we're going to take a look at the law with Louis Seveno of Woods LLP and certain legal challenges in this pandemic crisis. Today's Entrepreneur Special Remote Edition on CJAD 800.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult FL Fuller Landau, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Today's Entrepreneur, inspiring stories from outstanding business people by FL Montreal. Dan Delmar and Josh Miller with you tonight remotely. Another special remote edition of Today's Entrepreneur, focusing on crisis management. We heard from Jim Hindley of Hindley Financial Services just before on the insurance angle. And Josh, let's move on to law now. We'll talk to Louis Seveno from Woods. It's a litigation boutique that is certainly very busy right now. So he has an expertise in contractual disputes, corporate and shareholder litigation, insolvency, employment law, cross-border issues, and more. Louis Seveno, welcome to Today's Entrepreneur.
Thank you very much for having me.
How are you coping in law, especially remote, a little bit disconnected from your clients, more so than usual? How are you coping with this?
Well, it's a busy time for many lawyers. In a way, most of the court proceedings are closed right now and are suspended. But we have a lot of clients calling in and writing in with a lot of questions. And so we're keeping busy.
I think that's great, Louis. Thank you very much. And I know there's a lot of areas that you practice in, but I think we're going to focus on labor because that's clearly a topic for many entrepreneurs. No question, it's what the Canada Revenue Agency, the Canadian government, has been focusing on with their packages, and we'll touch upon more details on that when we talk with Peter Moraitis of FL a little later. But in the meantime, let's talk about that labor law. The employers, they're trying to figure out what to do with their teams. Their business is down. There's no question. They want to know what they're able to do. Do they have the capacity to modify working conditions for their employers, given the context of the crisis? What would you say, in this certain circumstance, are they allowed to give pay cuts, reduced hours? Can they change certain forms of leave? What do you say in that respect?
Well, employers definitely should be looking into that as a potential means of ensuring that their liquidities are kept in a good position. However, they can't do these things unilaterally. So this will involve strong communication between the employers and their employees. And there are a lot of things that can be done, but none of these items that you're discussing right now can be forced on employees. Otherwise, they can be considered constructive dismissal, which then gives rise to severance obligations and, in certain circumstances, even the potential for an order of reintegration of the employees.
Even if business is down and they can't afford it, there are certain circumstances where really constructive dismissal. I mean, if a business is just trying to survive, how is that possible?
Well, that's the thing, and I think we're going to get into it a little bit later. But in Quebec, there are certain elements that are available, like layoffs. Termination is also a possibility for economic reasons. But there's a difference between that and insisting that an employee remain as such, but modifying the formal and important conditions of employment for the employee. So what we recommend in these situations, and we've seen a lot of businesses do it, even a lot of them publicly. For example, if you discuss with your employees and say, listen, we can't pay you what we need to pay you normally. We can't have you work all these hours as we normally would. How do you feel about a 20% pay cut and a 20% reduction in your hours? We've seen employers do that successfully and be able to negotiate that with their employees. That doesn't, however, prevent employees that disagree from making a recourse for constructive dismissal. So this is something that can't be done unilaterally. We can get later on into things like layoffs, which employers can do unilaterally. And so typically what will happen is employers will tell their employees, listen, we're thinking about layoffs. We would need to lay off 20, 30, 40, 50% of you, even more, as we've seen in the news media. If instead we propose to you a pay cut, what do you think? And so if employers can get their employees to agree to that, that is definitely something that they can look into.
But that is something, Louis, I would imagine the pay cut, is that something that needs to be done across the board or with specific employees? Like with layoffs, I would imagine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, layoffs, it's not across the board. You can, maybe it's a wrong term, but pick and choose who you lay off for a certain level, where I'm wondering if a pay cut or a pay reduction needs to be done across the board.
It's possible that it would. Usually it'll be per category of employees or according to the use the company is making of those employees during the crisis. For example, if you have employees who can't work remotely because their job is simply a job that is done in person, it would make sense that those people be laid off for that amount of time. But what about those people who can work remotely? In that case, maybe then the layoff would apply to a certain category of people. And then for the other category, there could be a discussion about a pay cut. So I'm aware of at least one business in Quebec, which has done this publicly, where 60% of their force was laid off and the remaining 40 took I believe, a 20% pay cut, but is working 4 days a week remotely. So these are things that are possible. The employees had to agree to it. And if anything, employers can modify unilaterally these conditions. However, that becomes illegal if the employees refuse it and contest it.
So now what is the difference between, you can lay off people, but then there's a potentially termination. But termination comes with a whole other slew of requirements, and you really have to follow all the labor laws. And I don't want to get into that necessarily. We don't have time. But for businesses today that are dealing with business slowdown and need to adjust their payroll levels, adjust the number of employees, are layoffs really just the easiest thing to go through? And if that's the case, how do they communicate with their employees?
Well, here's the thing. When we mention terms like termination, dismissal, layoff, these terms have in common English certain definitions which don't necessarily always translate into legal English, especially in Quebec here, where we have our own legal system. So I think for today, we'd prefer to talk about layoffs. Layoffs can be permanent, in which case they would be basically what you would refer to as termination, or they can be temporary. And then basically the law will stipulate that if a layoff lasts over 6 months, it's basically the same thing as if it had been permanent. And then certain indemnities are payable by the employer in that case. So there is a possibility for a temporary layoff, whether on an individual or collective basis. And then it's just that there are specific rules for each. And then there are specific rules that are for the unionized sector, and there are specific rules that are for companies that don't have unions.
Thanks, Louis. So just to clarify, and perhaps this might be the last question we get to, when companies are determining which employees to lay off, are there certain criteria that they need to follow within Quebec legal guidelines, or is it up to each business?
There certainly are criteria. And the most important thing that a business needs to consider is that should the choice of the employees be contested, that it always be deemed to have been objective. And so the employer will want to look at things like which employees can or can't perform work during the COVID crisis. They'll want to look at things like seniority. What you want to avoid is any situation where you're either seem to be seemingly discriminatory, where you're picking and choosing employees. This is the kind of thing that you'll want to avoid. So there is a certain level of method to this, and it's definitely something that you will want to consult a lawyer on before proceeding to any layoffs.
Thanks very much, Louis. Much appreciated. I know it's a huge topic, and there's only so much we can get to in a short period of time, but thanks for at least giving us a great head start.
Thank you very much for having me.
Louis Sevigno, lawyer at Woods, talking about some of the legal issues. And up next, Josh, we're going to talk about some of the government help coming your way with PJ Moraitis, tax partner at FL, and what we can do to prevent insolvency. Patrick Sullivan on that. That's on the way.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult FL Fuller Landau, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Today's Entrepreneur, a program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business. Dan Delmar, along with Josh Miller with you, presented as always by FL Montreal, and another special crisis edition of the program, Josh, recorded remotely. And government help is going to be so huge for pretty much everyone going forward at this point. Are you generally satisfied with what you're seeing out of the federal governments and even the provincial government here in Quebec?
I think, Dan, it's yes and no. I mean, yes, I think there's a great intent. The intention is quite nice. The details are a little slow. All that being said, it is new, it is recent. Could they have done things faster? Listen, it's government. Government doesn't always move as quickly as could be. Thankfully, that people can avoid banks and go directly through government, where I've seen and heard in the U.S. that a lot of their programs actually are through banks first. Like the Paycheck Protection Program isn't directly through the government; it's actually through bank system. So at least here in Canada, if I may praise them a little bit, notwithstanding everything else that they could be faulted for, at least we're going directly through the government and not through a third intermediary.
On a more serious note, if things get really bad, we'll talk about how to prevent insolvency with Patrick Sullivan in a moment. But first, let's take a look now at some of the latest government programs. Peter Moraitis is with us, tax partner at FL. Welcome back, Peter.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Josh.
And Pete, this is information that is all fresh, and I think there's even still details to come out. But when we're talking about businesses, and I'll leave the personal stuff on the side for a moment, so that $2,000 a month that the government is saying for certain employees or certain people that are not working, well, we might come to that if we have time. But first, let's deal on the business side, that entrepreneurial side. This Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, the CEWS, or however they want to pronounce it. That they, started at 10%, went to 75%. There's definitely still details to come out, but maybe you can kind of quickly go over what those criteria are for the people that haven't really read it yet, or maybe you can put it in layman's terms what it means.
For sure. The one thing is that I'm noticing now is people understand why tax people can never give a straight answer, because now all these rules that are coming out, like you said, Josh, are taking time, and the details are not all there, and it's impacting a lot more people than normal tax measures. But essentially, this incentive, kind of like what you were talking about with Louis, where there's been a lot of layoffs and a lot of people going to request for this CERB, this $2,000 a month, is putting a lot of pressure on the system, and the government's trying to find a way to kind of reduce that backlog by just incentivizing the employers to keep their payroll on staff. And essentially, kind of some of the details that have come out this week, although the law is not yet issued, is that any company that would have suffered a 30% loss year over year for, let's say, the months of March, April, and May that are to come, would be eligible for a 75% subsidy of all their payroll costs for over the next 3 months.
But each month stands on its own, correct?
Correct. So since it's a month, year over year analysis over a specific month, and we have some clients that still had orders in March and didn't necessarily meet this 30% test, but they will definitely meet it in April since things have shut down.
So now, what about from we know that thankfully, basically all companies, nonprofits are part of this now, excluding public companies. But there are certain questions like, is this covering all payroll? Like if you're down 30%, you still have, you've laid off some people, you still have the rest. Is this covering everybody that's on a company's payroll?
Correct. So the way it was kind of announced was that they wanted to rehire people. Unfortunately, there's some businesses that, even it just doesn't make sense to rehire. So it's eligible for anybody who's still continuing to get paid, whether they're brought back onto payroll or if they're just the remaining core of the enterprise that are still being paid. One of the interesting things that they've mentioned is that they strongly recommend that the employers pay the additional 25% to the employees, but that they understand, given the circumstances, that if the cash flow is not available, that it's not a requirement. So this is essentially an opportunity for a business to completely subsidize people's employment, like what they were with the only cost to the employee, like a certain employer deductions, like pension plans and certain amounts like that.
Like what about group insurance? If the company keeps group insurance, I guess they're still responsible for that. Correct.
Yeah. The 75% credit is really for gross wages paid.
But gross wages, what if somebody earns $30,000 but they have a $500 a month car allowance?
Well, and I mean, that's not going to be something that the government would necessarily subsidize. It's not for like other benefits. It's really wage paid. Like that's more of an employment or a business decision with the employees who likely are not able to use, let's say, their car for business during that period. But I think like one of the interesting aspects is that they're really determining what was the regular employment amount that they were making prior to the crisis. That's going to be something that's going to be now law in the Tax Act, the COVID pre-crisis employment earnings, and they'll be and again, kind of like Louis was saying, this is something I imagine there's going to have to be a discussion with each employee that they will accept this reduction in wages of 25%. And at least for certain businesses like restaurants, hospitality, airlines, where there's really no longer any revenues, they can keep them on payroll and out of the EI system.
Will it be of anybody that's actually applied? Do you feel that the application or the process online, have you heard anything about that being easy or difficult?
So they have mentioned, similarly to the measures for individuals, that it's going to be available through online. So any companies that do not have a My Business account on CRA's website portal should maybe look into registering. There might be some delays where they send in a confirmation letter, like a code to be able to get access. And generally, when it's through that portal, things should be relatively simple if the employees have direct deposit. The Minister of Finance, Morneau, has kind of indicated that it will take at least 3 weeks, if not 6 weeks, before the amount for the subsidies are available. So that's where it'd be interesting to for Patrick to comment on on kind of the delays from a financing aspect here, because the wages will need to get paid out previously.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I think it will take some time, but it won't be too hard to handle.
No, and I imagine, and I know, Pete, there's also, it's March, April, May, but of course the periods of pay only start from March 15th and go to kind of 4-week pay periods that it will cover. And of course, all this is on the Canada.ca website.
An important announcement today was made. The government began to accept applications for the emergency response benefit today. This is the $2,000 a month government program to help those who have lost their jobs or are no longer earning any self-employment income for a period of 14 days due to COVID. Applications are actually available based on the month of birth for each individual. So today was those of the first quarter, January to March, and every day there's going to be another quarter until Thursday. CRA has already advised that they've processed over 1,000 applications a minute today for our incorporated entrepreneurs. The previous test required that applicants had to have earned at least $5,000 of employment income the previous year. Now they've also included non-eligible dividends in that $5,000 test. So a lot of people who pay themselves only by dividends will be eligible. And they've also announced that they're going to work on some measures for those who are continuing to work part-time for essential services but don't earn, let's say, the $2,000 a month. So they're going to be compensated as well. And also for that would be normally looking for a job now that school is ending.
So really, Pete, thank you so much. I know, as always, there's information coming out every day, almost every hour, it seems like. And as there's information that comes out, I guess it will just get shared with everybody. So thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks, Josh. Thank you.
Peter Moraitis, tax partner at FL. And on the way next, we'll talk about how to prevent insolvency. Patrick Sullivan, trustee at FL, on that. Today's Entrepreneur, special crisis management edition, broadcast remotely on CJAD 800.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult FL Fuller Landau, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Today's Entrepreneur, inspiring stories from outstanding business people by FL Montreal. Dan Delmar and Josh Miller with you tonight remotely again for a special crisis management edition of the program. And so we're looking at law and HR and some of the government benefits, Josh. We'll move on to preventing insolvency. And it's a very scary time for a lot of people. I mean, in some cases, people had completely healthy businesses just a few weeks ago and now are flirting with the idea of bankruptcy. Just in terms of advice, Josh, just general advice, what would you recommend for people that are sort of looking at the abyss right now? It's a very difficult situation to be in.
It is, and you really have to look ahead, and you really have to plan for the future, but it does start with the top line. So the question becomes, if your top line has eroded or gone to zero, is there any way that you can do anything differently? Do you have any resources? Do you have any reserves in the bank? I mean, there's so many things. Do you need to reinvent yourself? We've spoken about reinventing yourself on this Today's Entrepreneur for many, many years. Is now, it may be, hopefully it's not too late, but is there anything else that you could be doing to reinvent yourself, to make yourself useful? And I know it's a very case by case and tough, but entrepreneurs really, they have the time to think about it. So now's the time to think about it.
Patrick Sullivan is a partner at FL and a trustee to talk about insolvency and how to prevent those kinds of situations. Patrick, welcome back.
Always a pleasure.
And Pat, it's not a very fun topic to discuss. That being said, we know that sales are dwindling or dropping to zero, and some people don't have the reserves to stick around and fight this out for several weeks or several months or however long it's going to last. So what are maybe some of the things, whether it's from a restructuring, whether it's from talking to certain suppliers, what are some of the things that come off the top of your head to either try to minimize the hurt or avoid that closure altogether?
Well, number one, I think that the stay in touch, keep communicating with your suppliers is probably part of the key. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily help the top line business-wise, but at least you're facing the problem, and you have to bear in mind that your key suppliers are probably facing similar problems with their suppliers. So everybody sort of has to work together to go through these times. Now, you have to understand that certain companies were already in financial difficulties prior to the COVID-19. So they're going to get out of the map in any situation. Now, the whole idea is to try to avoid getting too many companies failing once the economy starts picking up again. Now, there are certain either formal or informal ways to try to settle with your suppliers. I mean, you can always try an informal proposal to your creditors, which basically is trying to stabilize your cash flow by dealing with your key suppliers and obviously getting some kind of a forbearance agreement in place that will allow you to pay them over a period of time without jeopardizing them continuing to supply you with the ongoing business.
Are you suggesting that? Are you suggesting that to be an official proposal, or more of a use your relationships and talk to them?
It's a user relationship proposal. It's really the informal way without using the mechanisms of the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, where everybody sort of gets put on hold prior to the filings. Now, obviously, doing it the informal way, there are goods and there's pros and cons to this way, because obviously you need to work with many suppliers. Some will require different deals, different ways. It's a turnaround plan that is difficult to put into place where you're sure it's going to be successful. In that some of your suppliers might have a grudge against you, and they'll never accept anything. And it obviously does not prevent those suppliers to literally petition you into bankruptcy. So now, yes, it exists, but
understood. Now the government is being generous and saying, delaying, GST, QST, sales taxes and all that. I haven't, necessarily gotten to deductions at source, but if they're giving leeway on that and you're not paying, the sales tax as an example, your business still could go down. Then what happens?
Well, obviously the government is giving information pertaining, pushing things forward. In other words, they're not giving you a gift. So yes, they're going to be authorizing you to defer such payments, but eventually they're going to come back. Now, obviously, business has to pick up so that you can get your input tax credits if we're talking GST, QST, and vice versa. But eventually, yes, the money will have to be paid at some point in time.
And if not, then
if not, you're on the hook. I haven't heard anything pertaining to director liabilities being waived, for non-payment of GST, QST, or whatever. So yes, we're deferring things, but we're not necessarily removing the right of the government to come after you at some point in time.
We're running out of time, but in 30 seconds or less, sir, is there any financing options out there that you've heard about, whether it's EDC, BDC, IQ, that you can quickly comment on?
There's a whole bunch of either provincial or federal programs that have been put into place, but I'd like to say just 4 comments on what really is required in order to be eligible for these programs. One is the companies must demonstrate that their financial problems arose directly or were directly impacted by COVID-19. They must also demonstrate that they were financially viable prior to the impact of COVID-19. Cash flows are a must. I mean, I don't think there's any lenders that will be just giving out loans and like in a candy store. They're going to require serious cash flows and projections to demonstrate that the company will return to a viable position. And obviously, the fourth one and last is all demand should go through their existing bankers first, because many of these programs are loan guarantees. They split the risk. There's a whole slew, and I mean it's a moving target. So there's new programs, there's new criterias, and I have to tell you, I've been talking to bankers, and they're still in the process of analyzing, how they can maneuver within all of these, and they're in touch with IQ, EDC, and BDC to say, okay, how are we going to put this in place and get the loans out? So it's right now it's more their bankers are getting many calls from their clients saying, okay, can we defer the payment on our mortgages? Can we defer the payment on our lease contracts? This is, it's a crisis period, and it'll take a few weeks in order for all of these programs to get into place and really have everybody fine-tuning the way they're going to work around this.
Patrick Sullivan, trustee at FL. Thanks so much, Patrick.
A pleasure, guys.
And Josh, a quick note to wrap up. What's your advice for today's entrepreneur going on a month into a crisis?
I wish there was only one piece of advice. I wish there was one magical word. But certainly for those that are going through financial difficulties, just don't go at it alone. Just open the door, talk to people, talk to your banker, talk to EDC, talk to whoever you have to. People, there is a willingness to help. If you've been affected by COVID-19 in your business, there's a willingness to help. Open the communication doors. Don't be afraid of the big bad financial monster.
Visit flmontreal.com to get the latest info on COVID-19 related support measures and pvisio.com to answer all your questions as an employer. And Josh, best of luck for the week ahead. Have a good night. See you soon.
The opinions expressed in the preceding program were provided for general information purposes only and should not be construed as advice from CJAD 800 or Bell Media. The preceding was sponsored content.